Hi, I'm Heinbach. It's good to have you back. This video is sponsored by DistroKid, and it couldn't be more of a happy coincidence because I just released my album Assertion. It's out today, and same as with every other release in the past 7 years, I used DistroKid to put it out on all the streaming services such as YouTube Music, Spotify, and Apple Music. This video is part of the series on how I made this album, and I want to cover two aspects. The first one being distribution, and the second one mastering, for which we'll have Nathan Moody come on just a bit later. For getting my music out when I'm not working with another label, I use two services. One is Bandcamp. Bandcamp is probably known to most of you. It's the indie record store of all online music sales. You can sell digital and physical media as well as merch there, and they also offer an app for streaming. And the cut that you get from them is one of the highest in the business. But one question that I don't get asked often is, are you on Bandcamp? I get asked, are you on Spotify? Or people just put their phone up and try to make a track ID with that. And for that, I use DistroKid. The first time I heard of DistroKid, I thought the name of the founder rang a bell. And indeed, Philip Kaplan ran one of the blogs I visited the most in the very early 2000s as the first .com bubble burst. Because at that time, I used to work at a bunch of ill-fated .coms, many of them related to music, and I could tell you stupid stories about the amount of money and idiocy that went around at that time. Kaplan covered all the companies that failed, sometimes spectacularly so, and it made me feel less alone because I ran through 4 different companies in, I think, like 9 months, maybe 10 months. It was a crazy time. So yeah, that's when I heard first of Philip Kaplan, and when I saw DistroKid and looked at what they were doing, I thought, this is gonna be a no-nonsense affair. In my experience, that turned out to be true. There never was any hassle with DistroKid. There used to be a lot of nonsense going on with music distribution, and it was kinda hard to get your music on the official stores, but DistroKid changed all that. And I love that, same as Bandcamp, they never changed their user interface. It's still the same plain interface with just some meme stuff added, and they got one feature that I really wish Bandcamp had, and that is you gotta bank with DistroKid. So all your money goes into an account with them, and then you just withdraw whenever you want. Where Bandcamp just takes every transaction, passes it directly through you, and by directly I mean PayPal gets their transaction fee. So PayPal makes money on almost every purchase every time on Bandcamp. And if there was a way to just have an account with Bandcamp and then you could withdraw the money once using an alternative payment service such as Payoneer, that would save me so much money and not make PayPal even richer. If you want to use their service and get 7% off, use the code distrokid.com/VIP/Heinbach, and I'll get a little bit of kickback for that. Now on to the second and probably the main topic of this video, which is mastering. And I personally don't like to master my own mixes. I think a second pair of ears from a skilled engineer can add so much translatability. While I'm rather confident in how my studio sounds, I've been mixing here for 8 years now, I think. 8 years, yes. And I know the speakers now well that I'm using, these Head 20s, and I always have my trusty Auratone to check, which is one of the nicest ways to get, or maybe not the nicest, but one of the fastest ways to get a mix to sound better. There's always room for improvement. Those of you who mix their own music have probably experienced that you're sitting in a car or you're in a club and your track comes on and you think, oh, this is my music, it's great. And then you realize, oh no, that's boomy there, and there's this noise that's kind of harsh, and and you would love to go back to the mixing board and rework that track. At least that happened to me. But a mastering engineer can really help with avoiding these technical errors, but it can also be a nice creative input. For this album, I wanted to work with Nathan Moody. A, because he's a friend. B, because I treasure his creative input. And C, because I know he makes good masters.
So when you master an album, where do you start? I start from 2 separate things. The first is the music itself. listening to the music with all of the meters turned off and my full attention dedicated to it tells me one set of things. Then it's the artist's intent in terms of mood, theme, subtext, and emotion that influences everything else. Heimbach has already been really good about being very transparent and open on his YouTube channel about the ideas behind this album, and that was a very important guiding light for me in terms of the decisions I made. And then I just validated those with him through an email chain, and then we were really just off to the races. This is my desk through which Heimbach's album is being run. Heimbach, of course, is incredibly skilled, and there is very little I have to do to his tracks, frankly, in the mastering process. So I've opted to go in an almost entirely analog signal flow because I don't need to do things that are very surgical, where digital can give you an advantage. And based on his workflow of working largely in the analog world, I wanted to emulate that for his album as well in the mastering process. So his tracks start by passing through a mid-side solid-state equalizer, and then from there, if the track has drums, then I wind up passing them through a really fast VCA compressor just to touch the transients and the microdynamics. And then after that, or if there are no drums at all, they pass through a tube compressor, which tends to be very kind of slow and syrupy in its reactions to dynamics, and is just a really good catch-all tool for just evening out macro dynamics. Sometimes compressors rob a little bit of the energy or the life out of tracks, I find, so then I usually run everything through a second equalizer. This is a tube-based equalizer. It's basically a stereo Pultec, and that just kind of brings a little bit more life through. And this also has a tube output stage that just sounds great even if the knobs are all completely at zero. From there, it goes into my DA and AD converter, running at this stage as an analog to digital converter, going back into the computer for final limiting, which I usually find is a little bit more controllable and transparent in the box. However, to make sure that my limiter plugins don't work too hard, I often counterintuitively soft clip the analog to digital converter. And what that does is it actually just rounds off the transients because this thing has a ton of headroom, and it can often sound less colored and more transparent than an actual limiter. But that's highly dependent on what kind of track it is. But I found that Heimbach's material actually was very well suited to that kind of workflow. It's day one of mastering, and I am starting as I usually do at dawn because I like listening to client mixes with absolutely fresh ears, so I'm not biased in what I'm hearing and I don't have listener fatigue yet. So I am starting this morning on the track Landstrasse 2020 because that needs to get done first for pre-orders. However, because it has a lot of percussive energy to it, it's also really great to start with because it will wind up setting the pace for dynamics, loudness, and stuff like that. So it's actually a pretty convenient starting place. One of the things that I love about Heimbach's work is that it's really immersive in terms of the stereo field and the stereo image. This album is a unique challenge because he's using both super wet reverbs and delays, and he's using a piano recorded with a spaced stereo pair of microphones. And that can potentially lead to some phase correlation issues, especially since we're going to be cutting it to vinyl. We talked about it as vendor and client, and what we've decided is we're going to nudge the stereo phase gently into correlation, not going to extreme so that doesn't feel narrow. And then we're just going to work with the vinyl cutting engineer to do the last pass to bring things narrow enough to be cuttable to vinyl, and that way we won't compromise the width of the digital version, so that'll be nice and wide and immersive. A really critical part of my mastering process is using mid-side equalization instead of left-right equalization. So this equalizer up here operates in traditional stereo left-right. So this channel is the left signal, this channel is the right signal. This equalizer in mid-side mode means that this channel controls the information in the middle of the stereo image. If you were to hit the mono button on a recording console, you'd only hear the mid signal. The side signal is everything that goes from the center out to the sides in the stereo field. So the reason why this is really, really useful on an album like Heinbach's is that I can say, okay, on the side only, every frequency below 110 hertz, I'm going to attenuate by -6 decibels. This is a mastering EQ, so it only goes to plus or minus 6 dB. And I'm doing that as a low shelving cut. So what that means is that everything below 110 hertz is mono, or is more mono. And so the benefit there is that I can control phase, I can control where things are in the stereo image in terms of center and side versus left and right. And this is a really critical part of my workflow on albums that feature piano and extreme amounts of very wet delay and reverb. One of the keys in mastering is picking the right signal chain for the songs at hand. And the songs themselves really, at the end of the day, tell you what to do with them. And so with this album, with everything being very warm and rich and welcoming in the low mids and low frequencies, it struck me that with piano and even the synth tracks, there's all this high harmonic content just bubbling a little bit low in the mix. So I can certainly EQ that, and I did just a hair, but what I opted for as a strategy is to run the songs through a lot of tube or valve gear. And high-end tubes tend to add this kind of upper mid sheen, harmonic enhancement, even if all of the knobs are completely flat and it's not compressing and it's not equalizing. So I found that that was a way to kind of just add a little bit of high-mid lift in Heinbach's final mixes without actually using equalizers. Another thing I like to do when mastering is to run things through compressors without really actually even compressing. You can see that the signal on this is super healthy, but the meters are literally not even moving. That doesn't mean that it's not imparting some color to this track, which is the guide, track 4 on side A, but still, even with the meter not moving, to me, it sounds better. So, was there anything worthy of correction on the raw material that I got from Heinbach. The good news is, well, very little, and that's entirely because of Heinbach's vision and skill. However, he left certain decisions to me in the mastering process. And a great example of that is the relative levels of the tracks. Here are the kind of after versions of the tracks that I did, but as you can see, track 1 is brought down by 5 decibels, track 2 is unchanged, track 3 is up by 7 decibels, track 4 is down by 4 decibels. If I bring these down to their original audio levels, you will see that even in the waveforms here in Logic, there is a huge difference in loudness between tracks. And that's, as a mastering engineer, as far as I'm concerned, pretty okay. I'm always willing to work with artists to figure out what the right balance of loudness is relative to the narrative flow of the album. But as you can see, these tracks are pretty hot, as is this last one, but track B2 and A3 are really quite quiet. And B2 wants to be quiet relative to these two tracks. It's a resting spot between a very long, very intense drum-centered track and a very powerful coda to the entire album. This track, however, really did want to be bumped up to a comparable volume level. So what I wound up doing is just leveling all of these so that one to the other, they're not all the same, but instead, the changes in volume from one track to the next made logical sense in terms of a mysterious introduction, a powerful second track, a little bit of a rest, a somewhat wistful track at the end of side A, this long, slowly building and then kind of holds on high energy for a long time drum-centered track, then a little bit of a rest, and then something intense at the end. So this is something that all artists can consider in their music sequencing process when they're creating an album, is not just what is the track order, but what is the rise and fall, what is the contour of narrative and emotional energy throughout the piece. That makes a huge, huge difference to the listener experience. You've probably noticed that I'm using Apple Logic to master Heinbach's album. And the reason for that is that the DAW you use for mastering kind of doesn't matter a whole lot. I do use Wavelab when I have to generate DDPs, or sometimes there are other project parameters that make that a better choice. But I have mastered projects in Reaper, Nuendo, Pro Tools, and every mastering engineer tends to have their own preference. And really, at the end of the day, all you need is a system that can ingest the client mixes that you're given, send them through whatever processing you want to do, whether that's in the DAW and it's entirely digital, or whether it's through an analog desk like mine, or a hybrid, which I usually do, and then have a way to get those processed files back into the system. Some people use 2 computers for this, one machine to play back and one machine to capture. I do it all on just one computer. So what I also obviously like a whole lot are meters. So I typically run a loudness meter, which measures loudness units full scale. I use a VU meter, which I like because this is what I was trained to read when I was taught how to mix in a studio. I tend to use this for monitoring the client mixes rather than my masters, because then the way I have this calibrated, the needles are often just pegged at the end for the master. The correlation meter, which is really critical for assessing how monocompatible a signal might be, or how cuttable it might be to vinyl. And then a real-time frequency analyzer, which I find invaluable. However, in Logic, if you hit the V key, probably for VST, it will hide all the meters. And this is usually how I listen to tracks the first time around. I look at the waveform, then I hit play, close my eyes, and throughout the listening process, I make notes. And then I go back to my notes and then show the meters again where I think there might be issues or things that can be enhanced. And then I can validate what my ears are hearing with my eyes. Well, I think we're done. All of the masters are wrapped. I slept on them overnight, gave them a listen with fresh ears this morning. And now they get shipped over to Heimbach, so we'll see what he thinks.
Short answer, I liked all the mixes. I had nothing to change. Everything sounded good from the start. There was one point when he mastered Landstraße 2020 and I realized there were percussion noises on the drum set. They were in the drum stem mix that Mason had delivered, and those got amplified. So I went back to the mix and cut those parts out of the arrangement. Actually, that benefited the music as a whole because the track became more driving, a bit less playful, but I feel that was also not necessary because the drumming was going for a motoric vibe anyway. If you like what you heard, you can buy the album on Bandcamp or stream anywhere you like, or buy the vinyl also on Bandcamp, and in Europe you can go to patchpoint.com. That might save you some shipping. That's it for this video. Thank you, Nathan, for sending over all this incredible information. It was a joy for me to listen to it. Check out Noise Jockey on Instagram, on Twitter, and if you're looking for someone to master your record, Obsidian Sound is a great place to go to. If you have any questions or think I left out things that you would like to hear in the whole making an album process, please write me in the comments or visit the subreddit. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Something I always love doing is inserting subliminal messages into the final masters. So on this album, if you listen very carefully, and you'll have to use some audio engineering tricks to hear it, every single track somewhere has a subliminal "I love Heimbach" message. So be warned that the more you listen to this album, you kind of might really start loving him a little bit more. You've been warned.